Simeon Kerr, it's 22nd of May 2023. Welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Thank you for having me.
From where you are sitting, should we tell you welcome to BRI Dialogues from Middle East, or should we say welcome to BRI Dialogues from West Asia?
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, that comes to the heart of where we are with the great China Gulf question at the moment. The region is still in the midst of trying to figure out where it actually is in that regard. I think historically we still very much feel within the Middle East, and that's the cultural center, that's the heart of the past history. But increasingly, absolutely, West Asia is where so linguistically people are talking about it more that way, but also politically and strategically, that's really where a lot of people see the future. But that dividing line between the two, I mean, it's a contested space, and one that I'm not sure how long that will take until we see some sort of clarity.
That's very interesting, Simon, because we here, of course, sitting in Europe, have a bigger dilemma where we have to score it with the Near East that the US throws into the mix as well, and so much everything pivots around this notion of the Middle East. But China, of course, as you know, has carved a very different geopolitical map for this part of the world, and they seem to be very much focused on the Arab region, separate, if you like, from some of the others. They've got the Arab policy 2005 and so on. So looking at these issues as closely as you do on a regular basis, the readmission of Syria to the Arab League, how is that likely to play out regionally, but also looking at it from the Chinese or the Western perspectives? Where do you see the pitfalls or the advantages of readmitting Syria being?
On the Syria question, their readmittance really being led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE at the moment, and they are both sort of taking this pragmatic view that Assad has essentially won, and they have to deal with him, and they want to try and rehabilitate Syria into the geopolitical system of the Middle East. They see some advantages from that, and their narrative is one of that you get pragmatic wins when you engage, and after this terrible decade, now is the time to do that. This fits into the broader perspective that they're both Riyadh and Abu Dhabi are leading on, in terms of trying to put past conflicts behind them, move forward. So that's the broader perspective on it. Specifically on Syria, we talk about little wins, in terms of the trade in the illegal narcotic captagon, which is really something that has devastated large swathes of the youthful population in the Gulf. They talk about how they can get refugees back. These kind of sort of claims get very short shrift in the West, where there is a really difficulty to try to come to terms with an Assad who's unrepentant. Qatar too is clearly, not on board, as Jordan and other Arab states. So there's a realization that there is going to be internecine concerns about this, but I think the broader push to put those past conflicts behind and move forward is what's driving this now. Now, where China fits into that, I'm not particularly sure. It's very much seen within the regional context now. China fits in more so in terms of, especially has done with the Iranian, Saudi détente, brokered in Beijing. I think that China is particularly, just very keen to see peace, to see, or at least a lack of tension, lack of war, in order to, first of all, secure oil supplies, and secondly, then build a more healthy ecosystem into which it can see trade flourish and investment flourish.
That's very interesting and weaves in nicely to the Belt Road Initiative. And you have been closely following many of these markets, Simone, for FT in your career. How is it going to pan out for the sanctions that remain and for the reconstruction? So if Rack Ceramic wants to ship, a sanitary system, how is it going to get paid? How would it be this populations go back if sanctions remain in the place for trade and commerce out of, JAFTA and other places? How are these actors who are proponing the peace and the rehabilitation going to come around this web of existing limitations for reconstruction, which is in favor of many of the countries for people to go back and to rebuild these war-torn countries?
In terms of Syria, that is clearly on the minds. I've talked about Captagon and your refugees, but the reconstruction is a big prize. The assumption always was that, of course, Russia will be the one that dominates this because of its, the way it acted to save Assad's regime. But the UAE had particularly close ties into Syria before the war. Dozens of unrequited projects that could be going forward. I mean, that's clearly on the mind too. I don't think it's that high on that. I don't think it's at the forefront at the moment. There are many other things that they're focusing on, particularly the UAE, beyond Syria when it comes to trade and investment. I mean, the rest of the world is by far more important. How it works practically, I think it's similar to how does Iran work practically. If there is some kind of, as there is right now between Saudi Arabia latterly and initially the UAE, a focus on trying to re-establish better trade and investment ties with the country as, this, debilitating decade of the Cold War that we've seen just maybe ending now, as they focus towards trying to sort of close, bind the two sides together through commerce and the economy and trade. How do they get over the sanctions? We saw this before when the JCPOA was signed in Iran. Great. Oh, this is going to be the best new thing. Dubai was booming on the back of this JCPOA. People thinking, oh, well, this means there's be a new rush. And there was limited amount of European investment. People took some gambles, but because of that, as you say, that pre-existing sanctions architecture, it was dead on arrival. I mean, there was no chance of financing significant amounts of trade into Iran. Similarly, I think we go back to Syria. That thing, that challenge will remain because there's clearly no appetite in the West to ease sanctions. I think I'm not sure on the Syria side, but clearly on the Iran side now, there are conversations going on between the countries, looking at how bilateral investment and trade flows can be ameliorated in spite of existing sanctions. Can there be mechanisms that are brought to fruition that will allow, trade and investment, which, because the UAE did listen to America and did implement a big part of the sanctions that were brought in by the Americans, they really reduced that trade. There must be ways to get around it, as China and India, Korea, and other countries have proved.
Simon, this is sorry, please.
No, I was just going to say, but these mechanisms have yet to be ascertained. We don't really know. We know they're talking about them, but we're not sure how they're going to come to fruition.
In one of our earlier conversations, the question of this, if you like, passive competition between the Gulf parties, Iran, UAE, Saudi Arabia in particular, in terms of acquiring patronage from China regarding BRI and so on. The assumption had been by some that Iran's isolation actually benefits the GCC countries. But as you've just alluded to this, but those limitations are now eroding away. In a sense, does Iran's rehabilitation, albeit in this limited fashion, help the UAE and Saudi Arabia to build on their BRI commitments already, to develop Iran's commitment with China as well? Or is there still a degree of competition between the three of them that China can play off?
I know how they would describe it here. What they would say is this isn't a zero-sum game. And actually, once you develop once economic development is occurring and growing, once you're growing the pie, everyone's going to get a bigger slice. And I think that is something that really they're quite keen to build on, and that sort of thesis is one that they really focus on and you want everyone to look at that rather than looking at the competition. Now, of course, competition is massive, like we see between UAE and Saudi, and now with Iran coming back into the game, maybe if these things build up, yes, there will be competition for resources, competition for the love of China, absolutely. But the overall narrative, one, especially here, I live in Dubai, I think that's something that defines the mindset, is actually if you grow the economy, everyone's going to benefit. That really has been the story of Dubai's economic development for the last few decades. And I think that runs deep. So yeah, look, there's always going to be competition. Everyone's always going to be arguing. There's always going to be spats about this or that. But the overall narrative being one that if we can just get peace, get growth going, then it's going to benefit everyone. That really, I think, is one that's the thought that's imprinted most strongly within the leadership here in the UAE, and increasingly some of the newer leaders that are coming up around the Gulf as well.
Simone, in that line, do you see a pivot or a gradual shift in investment strategies, portfolio allocations, and where the sovereign wealth funds or the big firms out of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, or Riyadh are deploying their capital? So, for instance, International Holding Company, or Alpha Dhabi, are they starting to pivot a bit of their investments from where you are privy to towards in and around BRI or China-centered assets, whether it be in the GCC, West Asia, or China itself?
I think they've been wanting to do that for 15 years, and they are doing that. So you see, Abu Dhabi is particularly active these days, sitting on a wall of cash coming in and desperate to deploy. And some of the new funds that are emerging out of some of the newer sovereign wealth funds, and obviously, as you mentioned, IHC and its chairman Sheikh Noon, who has definitely figured out that Asia is the future. Asia has been the future for 20 years, and it's taken a long time to get to that point. I mean, they're for as long as I remember, the idea of trying to parlay from just being this oil trade dynamic into one of investment into the fast-growing economies of Asia, that's been around for a long time now. It's still absolutely 100% a real goal amongst the GCC, especially the UAE. But once again, we're definitely seeing more than we used to, but there are limitations. The developed markets in the West are more comfortable, easier to access, and you just provide more opportunities. China and other Asian economies have always been seen to be more difficult to access. It's taking a long time for Gulf wealth funds to develop the expertise and the accessing the deal flow in those countries. It's definitely coming, it's increasing, but there always seems to be a slight limitation in what they can actually achieve.
It's in a sense, where they exercise soft power. There's an argument that the money comes westwards because it buys security. In a sense, if they don't fear China, nor do they bank on it for security, then why should they put the money there? But don't they look at the margins, Simon? Do they look at the returns on it? I mean, some of them, as we know, in the financial crisis, they took a huge hit as a consequence of investing in Western financial institutions. So they will have learned from that, right? When they look at, the comparators between East Asia and European markets and the US, don't they see an edge in being able to invest in Asian markets as these wealthy providers of cash?
Absolutely. I mean, there is they know that that's why the focus is on, potential higher returns from Asian markets. And there is a huge amount of effort being put into that. But the quantums are such, and, the advisors on whom they rely in order to deliver these deals, so often these are Western centric. The leadership still, G to G, government to government, there's a huge amount of activity between the Gulf and China, and it's delivering, huge amounts of government to government trade and government to government investment, and that is something that has changed, perceptively, definitely over the last 10 years, and is increasing now every year. However, when it comes to deployment into the broader economies, they know they need to do it, and they are doing it, but still there's so much money to deploy at the moment. And when there are challenges in putting that, or with when you've got your risk hat on and you're trying to think about how you're going to get your money back, there are still so many advisors who are pushing them towards, what they know, something that's been tried and tested. I think that is the dynamic, that's the balance that's being played. But there, 100%, they definitely understand that this is the future. They're going to have to get more, and they could get more out of it. And so when you see the new funds starting, they're more often than not, maybe putting their new office in Shanghai or in Indonesia. When you look at the free trade agreements that the UAE is pursuing at the moment, which are, quite significant, a lot of them are in Asian economies. There really is that focus on the big one: Indonesia, Korea, South Korea, and in the future China and Japan, and so forth. There really is a desire to get there, but I'm not yet 100% convinced that that maybe that cultural, intellectual shift within the thought processes of the top executives, the leadership is there yet.
I know Ali's poised, so I'm going to pop in before he does. So you mentioned FTAs, and that's such an interesting one. I know that the EU and GCC have been talking about FTAs since we were children, and it's still a subject of debate. So, are you suggesting that some GCC countries are now kind of beginning to look elsewhere? I mean, there is, of course, the American FTA. The Oman model is still out there, but nevertheless, given the attraction of Asia and these growing links being reinforced by BRI and such like, does that mean that GCC can afford to kind of let its FTA with EU sit on the sidelines in abeyance and then push forward with Indonesia's, Korea's, and China's of this world?
Well, FTAs, I think there are two things going on here. Still, some people are focusing on the GCC FTAs, that the EU one, which, as you say, it's been going on forever. The UK now, since Brexit, is also going along trying to get their GCC FTA. But what's come since the pandemic, since the UE decided that it was going for broke in trade, they've paired off from the GCC. So they have done some landmark UAE ones with people who are willing to negotiate with them as opposed to the GCC. So India, Israel would be good examples of these. Other countries, the EU is still negotiating with the GCC. That deal was, it's been going on forever. Maybe some of the blocks, the roadblocks in that deal were human rights clauses. There were things around protectionism in Saudi commodities, which since MBS has probably eased off somewhat, but the EU GCC one still seems stuck in the woods. The UK is coming big now, post-Brexit. They need to get them. So they keep going. So they've gone for the GCC one. at the same time, the UE is kind of playing footsie with them under the table, saying, by the way, if, as we know, we will never be able to agree all the things, just come with us, because we're willing to do deals on our own, and that will deliver you quick benefits that you can try and persuade your population that the Brexit's been a success. And so that dynamic's going on with the UK. EU GCC just seems to be going forever, but the UK is now playing this kind of like game of going through with the GCC, see how long they can do that, because essentially there's this real concern they don't want to annoy the Saudis too much by going off, with the UAE solo.
You reminded me of a joke when the groom-to-be is sitting at the table playing footsie, and after 20 minutes, the father of the bride says that, I know your intentions are good, but the leg is mine. But that's a different one. That brings me to another one, and that is I would say the competition for attention, for foreign direct investment, for alignment at the sovereign level between India and China, for the West Asia. And I was talking to some good friends like yourself in Dubai and in Riyadh, who said out of every 10 cars these days, there is something that they don't know what the brand is, but they are buying it, which is an EV car made in China, where you don't see a lot of Mahindras being sold in these geographies. And when you make a balance sheet of how many projects turnkey and infrastructure have been executed or are in the pipelines by Indian companies in GCC and beyond, they are eclipsed by China's. So how do you see that competition developing, Simone? And how perhaps this let's have a win-win-win mindset is going to play out between China and India in West Asia and GCC?
Well, there is going to be, I think China is, in terms of infrastructure development in the Gulf, it has a head start over India. There's been, when you look at Oman, when UAE, there have been huge sort of inroads, especially Dubai in construction since the global financial crisis. The banks using Dubai as their sort of Hong Kong for Africa. China has made this strategic move into the Gulf in a different way to India. I mean, the relationship with India and the Gulf is obviously very, very strong, but it's always been one based around more basic trade, population flows, workers, etc. I just see them as different dynamics. On the Gulf, from the Gulf perspective, there is, so for example, the UAE doing the FTA with India was a big thing, and they really wrote in a lot of clauses around investment, and that is ahead of where China is in terms of FTAs with the GCC. Once again, I'm not 100% certain on this, but it seems to be roughly that China is going down, like the UK, going down the GCC route, and it's probably it's a very complicated thing to get a GCC trade deal out, whereas India seems to have taken a different approach, think, right, well, we've got low-hanging fruit with the UAE, let's just go for it, which they have done, and trying to build on what is a deeper cultural relationship between the UAE and India than there is with China. With China, it's still very much government to government, going from an oil relationship to one that's maybe more strategic, very, very important. With India, it's much more, I don't want to say emotional, but there is more connectivity on various different levels through society that gives it the potential to do a lot more. We say, you mentioned IHC, we see how close they got to Adani, even through all of Adani's issues. There are, there seems to be lower hanging fruit for say the UAE to get within India than there is in China. But I think overall, as you say, with the numbers, China will be eclipsing India because it's usually G2G, usually government related stuff. And that's where you get the big numbers. But actually, when it comes to private sector, when it comes to the broader economic system, they're probably going to be much closer relations with India.
You've Ali brought up India, so I want to keep you in South Asia for a bit longer, but with two very different questions, Simon. One is to switch the object of India and China from UAE to Iran. There is all sorts of speculation about Iran wanting both China and India involved. But as you suggest, even in Iran, of course, there is a huge disparity between where China sits on the pecking order where India sits. But nevertheless, India is that bit closer. There is that closer cultural affinity between Iran and India. Iran senses that India needs Iran more than China needs Iran. They share Pakistan for good and bad and so on. So where do you see that relationship from the two Asian giants going? Do they face similar dilemmas as they do in the UAE, or is it a different matrix?
I think with Iran, we're coming to the end of that period. I think that's right. It was a symbiotic thing that both India and China helped Iran through that period of tight sanctions. That has been, they benefited from it, and they've also helped Iran get through that period now. In terms of, as we go forward, who's going to benefit more from it? I'm not 100% sure. I mean, I don't really have a strong opinion on that. What I can see is that, India's going to be keeping those relations alive, but does seem to be focusing more now on these kind of new, revived relationships in the Gulf. China, having brokered this peace between resumption of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, has managed to play a strategic role for the first time, arguably for the first time in the Gulf, helping to reduce tensions in one of these massive issues between the two. And I think that's what they're going to be parlaying more of as we go forward, trying to play more of an intermediary role and trying to see that this, as I described it, this kind of lost decade of sectarian strife, hopefully seeing that diminish somewhat, and maybe getting back to this area where there would be this chance for the Belt and Road Initiative to actually mean something. I think in the region before, it was atomized, and it was as you say, a subject of competition and experimentation. They never really had any chance to truly thrive. I think if you looking forward, if there could be some kind of reconciliation with Iran, and if they really were proper investment and trade between the GCC and Iran, I mean, that's going to be, it almost feels like ancient history when that was occurring before. If they can revive that, I think China will focus on trying to rehabilitate that ecosystem, and I think India clearly will benefit from that too.
Interesting that there's growth in shared interest as West Asia comes out of its deep sleep. The other one, Ali and I are really keen, given your knowledge and expertise and what you've already written about this, about the Karachi Electric Company, Simon. So I'm sure that not just Ali and I, but also our audience would love to hear your take on what's been going on in Pakistan.
Well, I mean, my knowledge of the Karachi Electricity Company is really only limited to the Abraj tale, and of course, now Abraj collapsed, the biggest private equity disaster. A lot of money lost by some money, not as much as other collapses, to be honest, but money lost by investors. Banks owed a lot of cash. Massive investigations. Arif Naqvi, the head of Abraj arrested and expected to be extradited to the US to fail corruption charges. Karachi was at the heart of this tale. It was, a failing utility, and Arif Naqvi led, Abraj into, an audacious attempt to turn it around, which, he was hoping would end up with a sale to the Chinese. And that was on the cards, but got delayed with various regulatory and political shenanigans. And it was that delay which actually led to the precipitation of Abraj's money problems. They'd been waiting for that money to come in, and they didn't get it on time, and that sort of triggered a chain of events which led some, according to the prosecutors, that that Abraj was moving money around internally in order to cover up the problem with spending too much money and not after having not got enough money in from the sale to China. Now, that is, it's seen, or some people argue that that geopolitics was something that led to this, that actually a Middle Eastern private equity company couldn't be allowed to get that sale, couldn't be allowed to allow the Chinese to come into Pakistan, and that therefore there was some kind of geopolitical conspiracy around the collapse of Abraj. So that's the conspiracy theory that's out there that some people propagate, especially in Pakistan. But I think overall the general view is that there was sort of there was a lack of control, and there was a lack of due process and proper fiscal management, fiduciary management at Abraj, and that's why it ended up going bust.
Simone, I think that element of geopolitics now, from electrifying and bringing light to Pakistan, whether it's sold to Chinese or some other consortium, one other discussion and topic of another call with you, hopefully. But going to North Africa, Egypt every few months has to come and ask for financial injection from a lot of GCC countries to make the ends meet. Is Egypt herself as well a prize sitting on the Suez Canal and a bustling population, and will be a next hub for massive splash of Chinese interest, capital, investment, and something like, hey, we are here to really turn around the new Cairo city and the new capital, etc., the rest of it. And should you have the money, United States, while you're searching how to pay the bills between, the budget ceiling increase and all of that, while you're making up your mind, we are here in Egypt. Do you see that happening, not tomorrow, but in the next 5 to 7 years, as Egypt becoming a prize for Chinese?
It would make a lot of sense, but I think already there were already plans to go to help build the capital, which got delayed. I'm not sure what happened there. Egypt is a complicated destination, as we've seen, from the Saudis. Some of the Saudis have limited the money they're putting in there, or they're not so much saying that explicitly, but it's widely assumed within the region that the Saudis are decelerating when it comes to Sisi's regime and supporting the government there, because there's been a sense that the investment there hasn't delivered value for money. Other Gulf states are a bit keen to do that, but I think when you look at the UAE's sort of greater commitment to making sure that money goes in there to keep the government going and to make sure that they can get through economic crises. I think at the moment this is really we're really at the tail end of the Arab Spring. There's still very much this kind of sense of commitment to this government that managed to rid the country from what they would see or describe as the disease of Islamism. I'm not, I think at the moment it's very much in that dynamic around trying to keep stability, in the mother of the world. I mean, that's what they want to keep going. Is that really where China wants to go? I think yes. Once the coming through the IMF program, and if this government can prove that it can right its fiscal wrongs and get back onto a growth track and keep currency stability, I can imagine it would that would be easier. I mean, I don't know, maybe they want to go in when they're very weak, I'm not sure, but at the moment it really does feel more like sort of emergency action from the IMF and key regional allies just to keep the ship steady.
Simon, given the currency of our BRI dialogues and the range of issues we deal with, I'll be very conscious of, while one pothole is filled, Yemen being a good example of this, and so on, another one digs itself, Sudan being an example of that. And we've talked about Egypt, we talked about Saudi Arabia and UAE and so on, as well as China and the West having an interest there. How worried is the neighborhood about this apparent implosion of Sudan as a state, but also this absence of order or the inability? I mean, Saudis are trying very hard with American support, but there doesn't seem to be much traction in trying to recreate a semblance of order. How worried is the neighborhood? And of course, it has direct impact on Egypt, being this important neighbor of Sudan and Saudi Arabia.
I get the sense that is the number one problem. I mean, I think there seems to be a reluctant acknowledgement that it's such a Gordian knot to untangle the military versus Hemeti's militias, and it's always been a sort of reluctant acknowledgement that and acceptance that we could be heading into a long period, but they accept that on one, even though you've got the Saudis and the UAE, they've both got avenues into both camp, especially the UAE with Hemeti because of his relations here, and so they do have sort of a little bit of leverage. But there's an understanding that it's not enough to untie this terrible situation. But maybe what they can do and are working towards is to just try and contain it and not see destabilization north into Egypt and east into Ethiopia and into the Horn of Africa. And that seems to be the number one priority. And that's what they seem to work on, particularly the fear that if Egypt were to get dragged into the war, if there was a spillover there, if Egypt gets involved, then there could be a huge issue with Ethiopia. And after having managed to sort of come to some form of stability there, that seems to be the worry. So that seems to be, from what I can see, what they're mainly focusing on now.
Simone, it looks like a lot of attention and concentration of opportunities, challenges, complexities continue to remain to be in your neck of the woods and in Middle East or West Asia. And for that matter, we definitely like to have you back towards the end of the year once some of these new détentes, ententes, and more frameworks come to fruition, and to see how long will they last and how they transfer and metamorphosize. But we bring our conversations to an end with a standard question to all of our guests, and you are as well, I'm sure, going to share your wisdom on that. What are your thoughts, suggestions, and one single piece of advice, the most important advice to the cinephobes and to the cinephiles from where you are sitting?
Cinephobes and cinephiles. I would just say, from my perspective, all I've seen is that there's been, something that seemed so far away, so distant, and such a sort of limited player. In the last 20 years, it's really changed very quickly. And the pace, and I think the pandemic is something that people really need to focus on, and the response to it. I think that has illustrated this brand new dynamic between the Gulf, particularly the UAE and China, in terms of, how, if the West, some xenophobes in the West would say we have to do everything we can to keep China out of the Gulf, and yet time after time, they limit the Gulf's access to, say, technology, weapons, or medical technology. And that's why being the pandemic, I think it was when, people in the Gulf and the UAE in particular were looking for things like PPE, vaccines, etc. They found themselves further back in the queue than they thought they were. There's a perception in the Gulf that we're quite high up in the queue when it comes to the West. Actually, they felt they're not. It wasn't just the pandemic, it was also, the response to, Houthi missile attacks in Abu Dhabi, got a lukewarm response from Western capitals. And once again, in the region, they're like, well, why not the quick reaction? Why aren't we higher up the pecking order in your terms, from your perspective? Why aren't we more important? And at that stage is when China is always there, willing to help out, whether it be, through weapons technology, or during the pandemic through PPE, and then a vaccine. I would say that they need to understand that the Chinese are really getting a lot more involved here, and are willing and able to help, and they do it without a lecture on human rights, and that all those factors together are something that's very, very attractive to leadership in the Gulf countries, and it's something that's gaining a lot of traction. And so I guess overall bear those factors in mind, because they've been bubbling away for the last 2 decades, and they're accelerating. Things like the pandemic and now technology are really accelerating them. And as we move forward, I think we're just going to remain in this kind of multipolar world where the Gulf will be balancing their long-standing relationship with the West with these new, increasingly important strategic ventures out into China. I think it will remain like that. But there are a lot of people, and I think including Western leaders, who are warning the Americans, saying, well, actually, look, one day you're going to have to, the Gulf will be told to decide between China and the West. There will be, an iron curtain through the world, will, go down. The iron curtain between China and America will go down right through the Gulf. And which side will the Gulf go on? And some people increasingly say that actually there will be a greater comfort and shared a vision for economy and politics and surveillance and dissent, and actually that will be a lot more. The Gulf might feel more comfortable with China. So those, I'd say, are the dynamics that are going on, and really it's be fascinating, over the next few years how those different issues fall, and how people react to them, and which side of the line maybe the Gulf gets on at the end.
That is an invitation for us to keep going with our BRI dialogues, Simon. So thank you very much for that plug. We take it anytime coming with some of your distinctions, certainly. We all got eyes, but it's those who can see so much deeper and broader with their eyes that matter. And then you demonstrated how that is possible. And really appreciated the breadth of the analysis that you've given us on such a wide range of issues. And I encourage our viewers and listeners to check your Twitter feed, amongst many other things, out, because there is so much intelligent analysis and information there that you've also shared with us today. So we really appreciate it for having come on our dialogues, but also given the signposts you've put down now, the next 12 months, 3-5 years, and so on. I suspect we're going to see a lot more of you for you to take us through all of these emerging milestones. But we all look forward to a day that peace reigns We are a long way from it, but your work hopefully will contribute towards a better understanding of why peace doesn't prevail. So we are really grateful to you. Thank you very much for being our guest.
Thank you, Simon.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure.